So we know that Duchenne is a disease of inflammation, and for a long time, prescribers have been using steroids to help boys maintain their function. And we have a lot of data to this effect. We know that glucocorticosteroids improve strength and mobility, allow boys to use their arms for longer, prolong ambulation, keep them on a wheelchair and on their feet for longer, delays the use of a respirator, and then delays the onset of scoliosis. And all of these milestones are delayed by 2 or more years, 2 to 5 years. So that's really significant. It's really wonderful. But one of the problems with the use of these drugs, like deflazacort and prednisone, is that they come with some unfortunate side effects, like weight gain, bone fragility, which puts boys at risk for fracture, growth stunting, Cushing-like features, suppressed immunity, mood and behavior changes, and a variety of others. And so that puts families in the unfortunate position of having to sort of weigh the positives against the negatives to sort of balance the efficacy against the safety. And in order to deal with that, what you do is to sort of play with the dose regimen to try to maximize the benefit and minimize the side effects. But unfortunately, in many cases, some kids just don't tolerate it and they're not able to use it. So ReveraGen is asking the question, is it possible to separate the positive from the negative? Is it chemically possible to separate the positive from the negative? And this is, I'll warn you, my most technically complex slide. I'm sharing it for those who are interested. If you're not interested, that's okay. You don't need it for the rest of the talk. So this is sort of the rationale, scientific rationale for vamorolone. So one of the founders of ReveraGen, a chemist named John McCall, had this idea that we could modulate the benefit-risk ratio by changing the structure of a typical glucocorticoid. So in blue here we have prednisone, and I'll tell you as an aside, prednisone is predominantly used in the United States, and in Europe it's been used for a long time. We started some of these studies before deflazacort was approved, and I'm aware that most of the folks in this room would have more experience with deflazacort, but there are some similarities and some differences between prednisone and deflazacort, and I'll try to point this out as we go along. But the idea here was that you could modify vamorolone or modify the parent scaffold of a glucocorticoid to have a difference. And one of the things that he wanted to do was remove this oxygen here, that red ball, and instead install a double bond here. And not really important what the details are here, but the effect of it is that it changed the shape of the molecule. So what I hope you can see is that vamorolone in red is kind of tilted a little bit on the sort of east side of the molecule, and it's also obviously missing the oxygen that was put in there. And so the effect of that is really to change the way that the drug would interact with its drug target in the body. And so this is a cartoon of the crystal structure of prednisone on the left here and vamorolone on the right, binding to glucocorticoid receptor, its drug target. And what I hope you can see is that the drug is a little bit tilted relative to the traditional glucocorticoid, and it's also missing this one bonding interaction. So that's a lot of information, but the point is that it engages with this drug target a little bit differently. And what we were able to find in test tube studies is that we can actually see what those effects are. So for example, with its glucocorticoid receptor target, it has a totally different effect than, for example, prednisone or deflazacort, where it doesn't turn on some of those metabolic side effects. So where vamorolone will engage with the glucocorticoid receptor, it doesn't sort of encourage or permit what's called a dimerized state of the receptor, and as a result, it doesn't turn on a certain set of genes. So those metabolic side effects are lost. But it does retain the anti-inflammatory activity, so it does repress some of those inflammatory genes that you are trying to repress and that are repressed by the other glucocorticoids. So in that way, it's dissociating the negative from the positive. A second target for the drug is the mineralocorticoid receptors, and I'm not really going to talk a ton about this, but there are other drugs that are in study for Duchenne, mostly looking at heart, eplerenone and spironolactone, which also bind to the mineralocorticoid receptor, as does vamorolone. And these are beneficial, and vamorolone binds in the same kind of way and sort of suppresses the activity of the mineralocorticoid receptor, while prednisone agonizes it and causes a negative effect. Now, just as an aside, deflazacort doesn't bind that, so that's sort of neutral for those of you that have some experience with that. So anyway, based on these data, our hypothesis is that vamorolone will retain some of the positive benefits or all of the positive benefits of a traditional steroid and lose some of those side effects. And so in order to test that hypothesis, we've run a number of clinical studies. And I'm going to take a minute to sort of walk through what these were, just because I'm going to show data from it and want you to understand where everything came from. So some of this information harkens back a little bit to what Lauren Morningrath talked about, how the drug is initially given it a little bit and a little bit more and sort of to step into safety. So the first study was really a short 2-week study where we were looking for increasing doses, a dose-finding study looking for the safe dose range. And so we started off with a very low dose, 0.25 mg per kg, dosed it for 2 weeks in one group of boys. When that was safe, escalated the dose to 0.75, and then again to 2, and then again to 6. Now, let me just pause and tell you a little bit about the participants in this study. So these were 4 to 6-year-old boys or 4 to less than 7-year-old boys, steroid naive, didn't matter what their mutation was, and they're all the same groups of kids that are going to be participating in these 3 studies. So those kids finished the 2-week study. When it was deemed to be safe, they rolled on to a longer-term study, a 6-month study, which is the second segment here shown here, where they were all on these different doses that were sort of the original doses. So it's a longer-term dose study. And then in the third segment, we're looking for really long-term effects of the drug. And here it's a 2-year study. And one important difference is that the dose response is no longer there. So we've had everybody roll onto the higher doses of the drug, which I hope will convince you are more efficacious. So this is a diagram of what I just talked about, but sort of on a calendar. And the reason I'm pointing this out is that that 2-week study was completed in 2007. The 6-month study was completed in 2018. And the long-term study, the 2-year study, is still ongoing. So I can show you some data from the middle of the study, but we don't have that finished yet, so it's going to be sort of interim data. And then I'll foreshadow that I'm going to talk later about a second study with a separate group of kids, a bigger study, with a larger group of kids. And so we'll be sort of repeating some of that data in that study. So here's some efficacy data from the 6-month time point. This is the primary endpoint. It's the time to stand, so that the boys lie on the ground, and then you time how long it takes them to stand up. And there are a couple features on here that I want to point out on the graph. So I mentioned these different doses. You'll see the low doses are represented here in red and blue. Each of those lines is the average of the group performance on average. And here we have some historical data from the Duchenne Natural History study, which you heard one of our prior speakers mention before. So this is a separate group of kids in a separate study, but it sort of orients you on what the expected performance would be. And then here in yellow and green are the high dose groups. And a couple things to notice about this. One is that the kids who were on the higher doses of drug at the 6-month time point performed better than the kids on the lower dose cohorts. So there's that. And the other thing that's important to note is that it improved with time. So the longer they were on the drug, the better the improvement is, and in fact improved from baseline. So that's very important. Here's another efficacy endpoint, the 6-minute walk distance. You're probably familiar with that. Kids walk for 6 minutes, you measure the distance that they've walked. And the pattern here is the same. So you see that the higher dose group performed on average better than the lower dose group. And again, the improvement increased with time. So the longer they're on the drug, the better they perform. So that's sort of, passes the gut check test. You would expect to see more improvement over time and more improvement with drugs. So very nice data from that study. So moving on to the longer term data, so this is after the kids have been on drug for 1.5 years. You can see this is time to stand data, and the data is represented just a little bit differently, where each of these lines is an individual boy. The spaghetti plot is opposed to an average for all of them. On the left here is the 2 mg per kg dose, and on the right is the 6, so these are both the high dose groups. And you can see, I hope, that the kids performed pretty stably over the course of the study of the 18 months in these 2 high dose groups, with the exception of this one boy who unfortunately did decline over time. And he was sort of a little bit slower getting up initially, so it's not, I guess, entirely surprising. It is important to note, though, that they were stabilized over the course of the study, and that's important because we wouldn't necessarily expect a group of boys like this to remain stable over time. There have been publications that have shown that if a boy reaches a point where it's taking him 5 or more seconds to get up off of the ground, he's sort of at risk for further decline. And in this group of boys, we did see stabilization, so that's very good. So this is my last efficacy data slide. This is the 6-minute walk distance at 82 months. And you'll remember that we had rolled everybody over onto the higher dose. I don't have a dose response to show you relative to the lower group, but what I hope you can appreciate is that the boys improved over that 18-month time course. These are both high-dose groups. And you can see that it tracks with improvement over time. So I think very encouraging data. These boys were increasing their walk distance by 50 or 60 meters, which is notable. So what about the side effects that are typically seen with the corticosteroid, and how does vamorolone stack up? So we took a look at the change in height percentile for age after a year of dosing relative to the baseline. And I think everyone in this room probably is aware, we've heard from Dr. Ma talk about this, that there's growth stunting expected with the use of steroids in boys. And after a year, what we found is that actually there wasn't growth stunting, that these boys actually had a slight increase in their height percentile. And that's really notable because in the literature you would definitely expect a reduction in their percentile. And this is an imperfect comparison, but if you look at the literature, there's a study from a few years ago that came out looking at deflazacort and prednisone. After a year, they were seeing a reduction in the percentile by 11 or 7% respectively. And there's some caveats here to this. It's not the same study, not the same group of boys. Can't really compare it perfectly. And the boys in the Griggs study were a little bit older. So we need to reproduce this data in our upcoming study. But I think it's pretty striking that we're seeing a loss of that growth stunting. And to sort of further support that, we did see an increase in a bone biomarker that is suggestive of bone growth. That's something that goes way down when you normally take corticosteroids. So that's further evidence that we're hopefully not going to see this, and we do have to reproduce that, but it's looking positive. So here is BMI data at this should be 18 months. I'm sorry about the typo, but after the kids have been on drug for a year and a half. What you'll see is that, and this is on the left, the 2 mg per kg group, and on the right, the 6 mg per kg group, so both high doses. But what you'll see is that there is an increase in their body weight. And again, this is a spaghetti plot, so you can see that some boys are more responsive in terms of body weight than others. And there are more responders, if you will, in the higher of the 2 dose groups. But still, we think, and we need to look harder at this in subsequent studies. We think it may be less prevalent, I guess, than with some of the other steroids. So in looking at the number of incidents of reported weight gain by a physician, so this isn't an average of weight gain, it's the number of times a physician reported that the boys were gaining weight on study. We saw with vamorolone after a year, about 13% of the kids were by reporting of the physicians having weight gain. But compared to deflazacort and prednisone from that Griggs study, actually those were seeing about twice as many incidents of weight gain. So again, with the same caveats as before, it's not the same study, it's a slightly older group of kids, and it needs to be repeated in a head-to-head. It looks sort of encouraging. We're hopeful that those data repeat. Even more strikingly, I would say, is the incidence of the Cushingoid features, which were reported by physicians. So with the vamorolone study, we saw 2.6%, which is 1 of the 38 kids was seeing Cushingoid features, compared to with the Griggs study, 60 and 78% for deflazacort and prednisone, respectively. So again, all the caveats that apply to the prior slide, we need to do a head-to-head comparison. It's not the same group of boys, not the same study sites necessarily, but that was encouraging. We hope that those data will repeat. So to summarize what I've told you, vamorolone binds differently to its receptors than a traditional corticosteroid, so we hypothesize that we will be able to see the benefits of the efficacy and fewer of the negative side effects. I showed you that the high dose groups benefited by standing faster and walking farther than the lower dose groups. And again, this was one study, but we need to repeat it, but it was marked improvement. We did not see growth stunting in these boys, and bone biomarkers, or a bone biomarker, suggested that we're unlikely to see that. We need to repeat it. Lastly, I'll mention that the incidence of physician-reported weight gain and Cushing-weight features were fewer than have been reported in the literature for other steroids, but we're going to take a closer look at that in the upcoming trial. So I just summarized the data from the phase 2 studies, and I want to pivot now to talking about the phase 2B, which is the open study that's seeking participants. This is a study, it's a very big study, it's 120 kids that we're seeking, 4 to 7 years old, or for less than 7 years old, so they must have turned 4, but they can't have had their 7th birthday, steroid naive, and any mutation. So there are quite a few sites, there are 34 sites, and still more, part of these are still coming online, but there are 4 sites in Canada that I wanted to point out. Of course, Dr. Jean Ma is one of the sites. Montreal is a site, Ottawa is a site, Vancouver is a site. So we encourage anyone that's interested to take a look in your program materials. There's some flyers in there about this study that you can take a look at, and then I'll walk you through the details right now. So the enrollment criteria for the study, as I said, are seeking boys between the ages of 4 and less than 7, or 4 to 6, have never been on steroids, and they need to have had a genetic diagnosis of Duchenne, but it doesn't matter what their mutation type is. The study is going to be 12 months long with the opportunity to roll over onto expanded access afterwards, meaning they can continue to take the drug and be monitored for safety, but they're not having to do all of the study measurements. The drug is given at home by mouth, so it's an orange liquid that they can take and drink. The visits are approximately monthly. There's 16 visits total, and there's sort of more of them at the front end, but then they become sort of monthly after that. And I want to point out too that there's no biopsy required for this study. So there's some blood draws and some other imaging things, and take urine and so forth, but no biopsy. The first 6 months of the study will have 4 groups of patients. So there'll be 2 of the vamorolone arms, so 25% on the 6 mg per kg, 25% on the 2 mg per kg, the 2 high, apparently efficacious doses. It's going to be compared to a group on prednisone and then another group on placebo. But then after the 6-month point, everybody rolls onto study drugs. So everybody will move over onto one of the 2 high doses of vamorolone. And lastly, I wanted to mention that ReveraGen will cover most of the travel costs to offset the burden of participating in the study. So if you have any questions or interest in participating, I encourage you to contact Suzanne Gagliano. She's an employee of ReveraGen. She handles all the travel and arrangements, and this is in that flyer that's in your packet as well. I want to mention that she's a Duchenne parent. She's got a son who's a young adult. She's participated in a number of clinical trials, not our clinical trial, but she really understands the burden. So it's a wonderful resource and just a wonderful person. So just to kind of put a little bit more detail on what this looks like, there's a period of 5 weeks that participants or potential participants are screened, and then that first portion of the trial kicks in where there are 4 cohorts, including a placebo and a prednisone arm, and then a 4-week transition period, and then everybody goes on to drug. So I want to shift gears right now and talk about this new program that we're launching, which we're very proud of. We recently got a grant from the US NIH to return clinical data to participants. So normally when you participate in a clinical trial, you put all this effort into traveling to the site and going through all of the tests and so forth, and this goes on for months or years. And to my knowledge, no one has ever gotten their data returned in Duchenne. You don't get the data back. and it's really stressful, right? Because you'd like to know how your child did independently and on average, and maybe inform your decision to stay on the drug. I don't know, you just might like to know all that medical data. But that hasn't been returned in the past, and it's a burden because the sites, the clinical trial sites that are running this, it's a lot of work to do that. So we had the idea, or Lori Conklin and Suzanne Gaglione had the idea that we would within ReveraGen create this sort of wall where only a few people have access to the data, and we can sort of re-recruit folks to sign back up to the study and de-identify them with this sort of wall in place, and that we would provide that data back. And so the idea is that everybody that is a participant in the old studies or the new upcoming studies would get a package of their data, and a package which includes the averages for the study, so that you know relatively how your son did. So really excited about that. We have IRB approval and are working on getting some feedback from the community about what that should look like. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about the way that ReveraGen is funded. It's a pretty unusual way to be funded, and what sort of some of the implications of that are. So we operate under what's called a venture philanthropy model, which means that we get funding from charities and the government and other kind of non-typical, non-venture capital investment kinds of money. And just to really put a fine point on it, this isn't just sort of some investors that want to find a nice place to put their money and they want to sort of feel good about things. It's actually a group of people who's really committed to making sure that drug development happens in Duchenne. So really kind of specifically interested in investing money in the tricky problem of drug development in Duchenne. And so, it's a collaboration between these government entities that do funding, these patient groups, the charities that fund and support the patients, and then also the academics, the researchers, and the clinicians who are, kind of every day working on this problem. And so just to, kind of contrast that with what sometimes happens, it's not a bunch of venture capitalists who are looking for a return on investment. We're not looking to be bought by another company or sell the asset. The goal really is to help the community. And so we like to say that we have stakeholders and not stockholders. And so here's a list of our stakeholders. There are 12 patient foundations, 4 government entities, and then 3 companies which have invested in us sort of late stage. And using this method, we've raised about $55 million to keep the drug development program going. And just to kind of drill into some of the details about why this is a good thing, it really helps, as I said, to kind of remove some of those business concerns from the process. So we don't have to worry about the business whims or, this isn't a good, sort of business idea anymore. We're committed to Duchenne, and that's what we're doing. Another thing which may not be obvious to this audience is that our work is peer reviewed. So we get grant funding from the organizations, and all of that is reviewed by their scientific advisors. And so if we have an idea that's kind of a bad idea, we're not going to get the funding. It has to be something that the scientific community and patient group community supports. And in fact, we get feedback from those groups. And so everybody's sort of weighing in intellectually on how that should look. The last 3 are, kind of run through quickly, but it allows us to be, very rapid and sort of agile in the way that we operate, because we're not making decisions as part of a large pharmaceutical company that's small and agile, and we're sort of working with the community who's bought in. It helps us to kind of reduce the costs, and importantly, it entices follow-on investing. So with the community putting money in first and kind of getting the project more advanced, then it makes it de-risked and makes it more appealing to other investors. And the last thing that I didn't put on here, but I do want to mention, is that these venture philanthropy investments are structured a little bit like a loan. So if we succeed in developing vamorolone, the community gets that money back, the stakeholders get that money back, like a loan on with interest, so that they can reinvest that money in the next generation of Duchenne therapies. And I think that's really important to point out, because it's not always that way, right? If we succeed, we're kind of feeding it forward to the next generation of drugs. And so with that, I want to thank the Vision DMD, the trial group. A couple of speakers from today were representing that. I want to thank our funders and NIH, and then most importantly, I want to thank Jesse's Journey and you for listening. Thank you.